Good evening all, and welcome. Prisons are scary places to say the least, for more than a few reasons. I'd also like to draw your attention to the competition which we currently have going on. If you would be so kind as to follow me on Instagram and Twitter, that would be amazing, because when we hit 3,000, there are going to be 2 prize draws, one for each, so, follow me over there to potentially win something. It's going to be good. Alright then, but for now it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. I'm a 21-year-old male. It was the 4th of July 2019. I live in Kansas in the USA. At the time I worked as a correctional officer at a maximum security prison on the night shift. The cell house I was in charge of was the maximum general population, 1 man to a cell. This is where the overall worst of society are housed. Before work, I was doing the typical American 4th of July thing, grilling, fireworks, and having a beer or two, and just generally having a great time with the family and wife. My wife kept telling me I needed to just call in sick and take the day off without pay. I really wish I had listened to her now, but I said no because we were really behind on bills. As the night went on, it came time for us to leave my mum's and for me to go home and get ready for work. I took my wife home and dropped her off, got ready, and left for work. My wife's car was broken down, so she was stuck at home for the night. As I drove to work, which is about an hour's drive away, I watched the fireworks going off all around. It was sad. I had never had to work on the 4th before. After I got to work and got all my equipment, I got into the cell house. Business as usual. Inmates were showered and locked up. I got my night cleaning crew out so they could clean the rest of the cell house, and met up with my partner for the night in the officer's station to get our briefing from the last shift. Fast forward an hour into my shift, so it's now right around 12:30 a.m. Another officer came into the cell house, so now there are 3 of us. This happened often on night shift, as there was nothing to do except rounds every half hour or so. Out of nowhere, we hear an inmate laughing like a witch, like a cackle. That was strange, but nothing to be alarmed with. Drugs were a bad problem in that facility. Still is, as far as I know. Eventually, after a few more cackles, I decided to go see who was making the sound, in case they were high. I walked through and checked all 200 inmates. Nothing. There were a small few that were even awake. So I brushed it off and went back to my office. My partner and the other officer were asking if there was anyone that needed their cells searched. I couldn't think of anyone in particular I suspected of having anything, so I went and checked all the cells again to see if I could get a whiff of smoke or see something. As I was walking on the 2nd story, I found an inmate that was acting weird. He was in his bed facing the wall, talking. This was also common, as there were a lot of inmates with minor mental issues. I figured he was high, because he turned and looked at me and told me to piss off. I was going to leave him alone, but the disrespect made me change my mind. It's now 20 minutes to 1 a.m., July 5th. I walk back to the office and tell the other 2 officers which cell he was in, and I wanted him searched. Cell 218. So, how the cell house is laid out is there are 100 cells per level. From the officer's station you can see the north side first and the 2nd floor, but you can't see the south side unless you walk the 50 feet over to it. Picture the movie Shawshank Redemption type cell house, except instead of being able to look through and see cells across, you just see a wall. The cells are literally back to back. As the officers go to put him out of the cell and go to search it, I went to the ground floor and was watching from below. The reason why is I wanted to get the inmate on the ground level and not the second floor. All that there was for protection from going over the edge was a handrail. I noticed the inmate was taking forever to get out of his cell. He came out in shorts and a do-rag, which is weird because he wasn't fully clothed. Didn't even put sandals on, just shorts and a do-rag. Yet it took him 5 minutes to get out. That made me very nervous. The inmate was a 6-foot-tall, 250-pound muscle-bound dude, and definitely had size on us. So from the ground I holler at him and tell him to come down to the ground and that he could use the phone or check his emails or commissionary. He declined my offer, which never happens, and I knew something was up. He was watching them search his cell from the control panel box. This was alarming. They were in his cell. I was on the ground. He could have easily ambushed them. He would have made it to them before I could have got up the stairs. So to try and keep them safe, I went upstairs to the inmate. He was standing in the corner away from the handrails at the top of the stairs. He knew I was the officer in charge of that cell house, and he knew I was the one that saw him talking to himself. He asked me why he was having his cell searched. "It's nothing personal, man," I said, even though it's a lie. "I have a quota I have to fill for cells searched in a night, and you're awake, so I chose you to have you searched. It'll just take a second." He was uneasy. He was pacing. Something wasn't right. Then I saw it. He had just turned right, and I saw his durag and the Samsung logo reflecting on the cell house light. Crap. I knew there was going to be a problem as soon as I saw it. He had a cell phone. I called over the radio for 2 additional officers to come to me. The inmate didn't seem to notice I made the call. My supervisors responded saying 2 of them were on their way. As a side note, at this time only segregational officers had protective vests, so out of the 5 of us that were now in there, only 1 had a vest. I was not that one. The officers were named South, who had a vest, McCormick, Collins, Sheffield, and me. It's now nearly 1 a.m. As soon as South and McCormick got up to me, I told the inmate to turn around and cuff up. South and McCormick were on the inmate right side, and I was in front of him. "Why?" he angrily asked. I refused to give him a reason at first. After a few minutes I'd had enough. I told him, "Look man, I can see the cell phone in your durag. You know you're not supposed to have that." The inmate then gets a defeated look on his face, but fire in his eyes. His body relaxes, and he slowly reaches up to retrieve the phone. But does he pull out a phone? Nope. He pulls out a 6-inch sharpened metal rod with ripped fabric wrapped around the bottom as a handle. Everything froze for me. I knew I was about to perish. Everything starts moving again. I now have an inmate twice my size charging and thrusting quickly and repeatedly towards me. "Oh crap," was all I was able to yell. I immediately went into defensive mode, trying to grab his arm and disarm him. His wrist kept slipping. I couldn't keep a hold of it, but at least I managed to block his attempts at my lower abdomen. Suddenly, he aimed high and went for my chest. It felt like it made contact. I had just been stabbed in the right part of my chest. I yelled at the top of my lungs for them to spray him. McCormick was already working on spraying the MK9 OC spray. For my listeners who understand military lingo, you'll know what I mean. For others, the MK9 comes as a pressured spray bottle. You can buy it at camping stores in the USA. It's called bear spray. It's the stuff that you spray in bears' eyes so you can get away. South had come up behind the inmate, grabbed him around the chest and pulled him backwards right as McCormick sprayed. I didn't realize it at the time, but the spray hit me, the inmate and South as well as everyone near us. I was able to turn and run. I ran around the stair railing, past the panel box, and out onto the run of the cells on the second story. I ran past a few cells and turned around to see he wasn't chasing me, but South was wrestling him to the ground, while gagging on the OC, and so was I and McCormick. Sheffield, having heard the commotion, came running out of the cell and saw what happened and ran for help. The inmate grabbed South by the vest and tried to throw him over the end of the landing, but South dropped to his knees before he went over. I grabbed the shoulder mic and screamed into it, "Level a response to Charlie 2 now." Dispatch said something back, but I didn't hear it. I started to charge back to save South. Before I could get away from the cell, I was in front of Collins, who grabbed me from behind and told me not to go. Due to the layout of the runs, I didn't see, but Sheffield grabbed the inmate from behind and body slammed him on his face and began cuffing him. Sheffield got covered in OC as well, due to the inmate being covered in it. As soon as Collins let me go, I stood still and watched. Up the stairs came 4 more officers, the captain and lieutenant. The lieutenant came and asked me what happened. I started to explain, but he cut me off as he saw blood coming out my left arm. After taking me out of the cell house, he made me lift my shirt up because he saw blood. He examined all my wounds. He had me remove all my equipment and hold paper towels to my arm. I was rushed to the ER. I was able to grab my phone out of my rental car, as I had totaled my car a few weeks ago by hitting a deer, and called my wife and told her what happened. She called my parents and siblings. Luckily, my injuries weren't too bad. I was stabbed 4 times, once on my left arm just below the elbow. That was through and through. The blade went in one side and out the other. Twice at the top of my left hand, and once where it hit my chest and went into the skin and hit one of my ribs, keeping it out of my lungs. Out of the 37 plunges, I think it's safe to say I'm lucky I'm still here and able to share this story. I didn't sleep for 2 days following the event. I still have nightmares about it almost daily. I'm always paranoid and I openly carry a firearm. After my attack, I was forced to resign for safety reasons. Everyone statewide that works in maximum prisons now has a vest. None of the people from there talk to me anymore, and I feel abandoned. I have one guy from that facility that I still see, my sergeant who wasn't there that night. Court is coming soon to add 3 more attempted murders on the guy. Turns out he was a shot caller from the Crips gang. To the guy who stabbed me, let's not meet again aside from court, because I have a hollow point with your name scratched into it. I'm 24 years old and a prison guard in a federal correction facility somewhere in North America. I usually work night shifts, and in fact, I've adjusted quite well. I maintain a healthy routine and diet and exercise regularly, and routinely get 7+ hours of sleep during the day to give you a good picture of my mental health. I also have experienced some strange phenomena in my life, but have always remained a skeptic. Anyway, one night a little while ago, I was working on the maximum security unit of our correctional facility. It was a relatively early time in the morning, and my partner had gone up to do their own thing for a while before our obligations. Seeing as this is pretty normal, I threw my feet up on the desk of the control post and began to read my book to kill some time. The way I was facing, I could see the monitors over my book. In case something happens, I can see it. Now, anyone who works down there knows that weird stuff happens regularly. Shadows moving, things moving on the cameras, strange sounds. but most of us chalk it up to the fact that generally it's late at night, 3 or 4 in the morning, and we've been up since probably 3 to 4 p.m. the previous day, and we just ignore it. This time, while I'm reading my books, I see movement on one of the cameras. I check all of the cells and everything's good. I look back, and there's movement on a different camera, and then a different one. Every time I look at one, something's happening on a different one. When I say movement, I mean I can see a figure moving, or I can see things on a table or countertop moving. After probably about 30 seconds, even though it felt like forever, everything sort of stops. I take a deep breath and tell myself it's probably just my imagination and to not worry about it. So I lean back, throw my feet back up, and go back to my book. Here's where things get really creepy. As I'm reading my book, a completely black and large figure appears outside my control post, in the exact spot a person would be if they needed to communicate with me from outside the control post. There's actually a large silver mouthpiece that we use to communicate when the control post has to be secured during the day. This figure looms there for probably no more than a second or two, and then disappears. The figure was quite large. Again, I just sort of sit back and not think anything of it, although I'll admit that my nerves were a little rattled regardless. My partner comes back down to grab his things before his obligations take him back up to the main part of the correctional facility. He sits down and we chat for a minute, and I tell him what I had just experienced. We both laughed and said it was probably nothing. In fact, he said, if there were a ghost here right now, he'd tickle my balls. We both laughed some more, and he told me, stop being a coward. I laughed some more and convinced myself that I was just abnormally tired and had been seeing things. He leaves to do his thing, and as I'm letting off the maximum security unit, one of the female inmates on our segregation range began screaming incoherently. She presses her emergency only button, and I radio my friend to come back down so that one of us can go check. He immediately comes back down and asks me what the hell's going on. I told him I had no idea, and she just started screaming at the top of her lungs as soon as he'd left. He decides that he'll go back down to check on her, to take the disable key for the alarm and proceed to her door. Being as the segregation range is right beside the control post, I stood by the door to listen to what she was screaming, and it was more or less along these lines. You've got to help me. He's trying to end me. Oh my God, please help me. Don't let him get to me. You get the picture. At this point, she's crying hysterically, banging on the door, and she actually hurt herself trying to bust the gigantic steel door open. My friend turns to me slightly pale, and we both shrug our shoulders, not really sure what's going on. He calmly explains to her that she's been locked up for days, and that the institution's been locked down since the previous evening, and that no one has gotten in, and that she was safe and that no one could hurt her. She continued to scream and cry hysterically when she said, "You idiot, you don't understand, it's my husband, he's here, he's trying to end my life, please, he's right behind you." At this point, my friend is frozen in raw animal terror. I, standing by the door, can see that there is no one behind him, but a tangible presence was definitely felt by all of us on that range. He later told me he was so scared that even though he knew no one was there, he felt it and couldn't turn around. After some talking, we eventually got her to calm down. She eventually explained that every so often, when she's being bad, her husband comes and haunts her and abuses her like he used to. She says it starts with nightmares and eventually leads to his presence wherever she is. I told her we would get the psychologist and healthcare teams to see her as soon as they were in for work. She begged to see if they were in now, and I agreed to call but told her I couldn't promise anything. I phone healthcare and naturally no one picks up, so I hang up before the answering machine kicks in. She eventually goes back to sleep. My friend goes on with his business and I'm stuck alone in the control post for the next half hour. Nothing else happened while I was there, and I was thankful for that. I told my co-workers who'd finally come in for day shift what had happened, and no one could really believe me, but they could see that I was legitimately shaken up by it, and know that I'm not the kind of person who would lie or embellish a story like this in any way. I finally get relieved and head home for an unsettling sleep. Now, the next two details are going to sound made up, kind of like the cherry on top, but I assure you, they actually happened. First, my friend does some research on this particular person, and it turns out she'd previously ended her husband's life as he was violent and abusive. He was approximately 6'7" and weighed 275 pounds. The creepiest thing about this was, and perhaps I'm extrapolating, that more or less describes the scale of the black shape that I had seen outside the control post. Second, I guess right after I'd left, about the time the rest of the institution staff comes in for their shift, my co-workers got calls from healthcare who sounded a little strange. They asked if anyone had called and left a message. My co-worker told them that I'd called about an hour and a half before anyone got there but hung up without leaving one. They said that was extremely strange because they got a message at 5:30 when I called, and all they could hear were two people screaming. Spooky as hell. Truthfully, my eyes watered the entire time I was recounting the story and go over the details in my head. Despite being skeptical, I'm almost certain it was her deceased husband. If anyone has a similar story or even something totally unrelated, I'd love to hear it. I am a correctional officer at an old Supermax prison in southern Arkansas. For context, I'm about 6 foot and 200 pounds. I work in the oldest part of the prison, in isolation, which houses our more difficult inmates. Most prisons, to my knowledge, have one. Per policy, the inmates are to spend about 23 hours a day and 29 days at a time in a tightly confined cell, where the only time they can come out is to go into a more spacious cell, outside and behind the isolation unit. Still fully restrained in waist chains and leg irons. I work the night shift, so most of the time those assigned are sleeping, and I just have to check on them every 30 minutes or so. Every cell has a camera located above, so we can see what every inmate is doing at all times. Now, I had heard the rumors circulating around the prison about it having been haunted, but I'm not one to believe these type of things, as I'm agnostic and don't particularly care for the sort. I was working nights in isolation, as I had mentioned before, as I'd been working this post for quite some time and could pretty well handle myself. I was making my rounds amongst the cells and tiers to check on the inmates in my custody. Right before lights went out, an inmate had told me he thought he had seen a face looking into his window and asked who was allowed to be running around at this time of night unshackled, as it wasn't fair. I told him no one was out of their cells, as I had just done my rounds and made sure of it. He then said, "No, I swear I saw someone. Some dude was walking around out there and looked into my cell." I was thinking he made it up. I proceeded to wave him off and ordered him to return to bed, or he would be written up. He then said, "Man, screw you, I know what I saw," but did as I asked. I thought that was weird, but went on my rounds as normal. At the time, we only had about 3 vacant cells to which the doors were slightly ajar, in case someone had started a fight or threatened an officer during the night. It was about midnight and I was getting ready to count the inmates assigned to me, which is something we often do to account for all of the inmates we have on the compound. While doing this, I was passing the empty cells, and I noticed that there was a blanket that looked like it had someone under it. I opened the cell door wider to see inside, and sure enough, there was someone under the blanket. I saw a pair of feet, and the blanket was laid over the top of the body like someone was sleeping. I thought about what the inmates had said, and about how I guessed the inmate was right. Someone was walking around freely in isolation, which is a big no-no. I retrieved my notepad and wrote down the details of what I was seeing, like the time and which cell it was. I then proceeded to radio for Master Control to send me a supervisor to provide me with some backup, in case whoever was in the cell became combative, as I was the only one in the area. As I looked up from my notepad after taking my notes, I realized there was no one there. The bed was now empty. I looked around and didn't see anyone either. There was no way in hell anyone had gotten up without me hearing it, or gotten past me without me seeing it. I looked around and couldn't find anyone out their cells. About 5 minutes later, my supervisor showed up and asked me what the hell was going on. I explained the situation, and we looked around and checked all the cells to make sure they were secure and still occupied, which was the case. We decided to review the cameras to see if someone really did come out, or was even in there in the first place, but what we saw shocked me to the core. Upon watching the cameras, we saw me doing my rounds as normal, checking all the doors that were occupied and counting the inmates. Then we watched me come up to the empty cells, open the door wider and look inside, step out and write down everything and then radio Master Control. You could see inside the cell, you could see the body under the blanket with the feet hanging out of them. But when I looked down at my notepad, I watched the blanket on the camera relax over the frame. My supervisor and myself looked at each other and then back at the camera. He then explained to me that years prior, an inmate had taken his life in that same cell by tying one side of the sheet around his neck and the other around his side of the bed around his feet, and that he believed it was the inmate still haunting the isolation corridor. Needless to say, I never worked that post again, and still haven't to this day. I was a nurse at my county's prison. The area was having a drug bust every 2 or 3 days, it seemed. We get a batch of 10 in, and everyone clears except for this one woman. She was nodding in and out of consciousness and slurring her words. So I get one of the COs to obtain a urine sample to do a spot drug test. Sure enough, the whole test lit up. So she's placed in detox for a few days, and then we would retest her. A few days pass, and she's not getting any better. In fact, she got a lot worse. So we drug tested her again, and the test came back positive for everything from THC to benzo. I have the COs search her thoroughly in case we miss something, and sure enough, this lady has 2 extra large condoms stuffed up her jail purse, and they both were torn open. We counted a total of 200 pills she was carrying. By all rights, the girl should have perished, but she recovered after that. This happened about 5 months ago. I had just gotten home from work around 9 p.m. and had barely had time to get my shoes off when I received a phone call from an unrecognized number. I'm searching for new jobs and thought it might be one of the places that I was applying to calling me back. I pick it up and it's some guy who says he's with some kind of third-party detention center, which, as he explained, was for low-risk inmates that were sent there whenever the local jails were too filled. That should have set off a nice big red flag for me, but for whatever reason it just made sense in my tired brain. I'm getting ready to tell you guys I'm not interested in making a donation or anything like that, when he asks me if this is my full name. I confirm, and he says that they're holding my boyfriend at this center, saying my boyfriend's full name and giving a dead description of me. I ask what's going on, since my boyfriend is supposed to be at work right now, and the guy on the other end provides an explanation. He says that my boyfriend had struck a pregnant woman with his car on his way to work and was 4 times the legal limit for blood alcohol. The woman was in critical condition and that my boyfriend had broken a few ribs and his nose in the accident. I'm freaking out at this point and ask if I can speak to him, to which the man obliges. I'm put on hold for a minute or two before my boyfriend picks up the line. This person on the other end was panicking, saying how it wasn't his fault and begged me not to tell his parents, using my name again. It didn't particularly sound like my boyfriend, but I figured it was him because of the broken nose he supposedly had, and his tone really helped to sell it, because it sounded so legitimate. The man from before comes back on the line before I can ask any questions and explains that they have to sedate my boyfriend since he began to panic and hyperventilate, which I was starting to relate to more and more by the second. The man on the other end tells me that I should come right away and that the bail is set at $2,000 cash. I stupidly tell him I don't have that much and that I maybe have half of that. He tells me it's fine and that I can work something out with the front office once I get there, and to just bring what I have, and seeming like he's trying to calm me down. He gives me the address and I can barely hold a pen because my hands are shaking so badly, and I'm very poorly trying to hold back tears. All of a sudden, the door opens up, and in walks in my boyfriend, completely normal looking with no broken nose, but more than a little confused as to why I'm crying. I'm still on the phone with the man, and asking what the hell he thinks he's doing, telling him how my boyfriend just walked in, and he promptly hangs up. I tried calling back a few times, but it went directly to voicemail. Finding out the power to the bar my boyfriend works at has gone out, so his boss sent everyone home early, and I had never in my whole life been so grateful for a power outage. My boyfriend slept on the couch to keep watch, but unfortunately I still couldn't sleep that night. So I decided to look up the name of the organization the man said he worked for. Big surprise, that turned up nothing. I then looked up the address he had given me on Google Maps and see it was some random abandoned strip mall in the middle of a sketchy-ass area that was about an hour and a half out of town. What really freaked me out about this whole thing was the guy knew my number, both me and my boyfriend's names, but didn't sound like anyone we'd met before. I have no idea what would have been waiting for me there, but I'm counting my lucky stars right now. So to the guy who wanted to meet me for God knows what in that sketchy-ass strip mall, let's not meet. I worked night shift at a county jail for a little over 2 years, and we've had some pretty strange things happen while I've been working there. A lot of the staff and inmates believed the jail was straight haunted or had a presence. The stories were pretty interesting, and sometimes I'd see weird or hear a weird noise. A lot of noises I would often write off as just an inmate yelling or doing something silly. It is a jail after all. There are a couple of moments I've had a hard time explaining. One night after we locked all the inmates down, me and another officer went and chilled in the tower. This is where all the video monitors are located. Outside the tower is a slim hallway that circles the tower, the pod where the inmates stay. Doors are secured, and the only way to get through these doors is by someone opening the door in the tower. Anyway, my buddy and I were chilling in the tower just talking about random stuff. If someone isn't brought in at night, the hours are pretty slow. Something slams against the tower door. Both of us nearly jump out our seats. The thud shook the walls of the tower. The first thing we think is that it's an inmate and that they somehow escaped their cell and got through their pod door. Our only other co-worker was still sitting in the booking area. We could see it with the camera, and the only plausible thought was that. We both jumped out, pulled our tasers out, and opened the tower door, to be met with nothing. All pod and cell doors were secured. We both walked back to the tower and started at each other. It was way too loud and forceful to be an inmate kicking their cell door. We talked about it several times and tried to think of ways to debunk it, and we couldn't. At the time, we were both scared out of our minds. I've also had a few other experiences. A lot of them revolved around seeing black shadows on the cameras. I remember me and 2 other co-workers were in the tower at night, and I saw a shadow on the wall of the rec room. I pointed it out, and we watched it glide across the wall, then stop, move back over, move up a little bit, then it went up, and disappeared out of the view of the camera. It was about 1 a.m, so it obviously wasn't an inmate or anyone in there. One of my co-workers who refused to believe in the paranormal wrote it off as a bug on the camera lens, but I don't think that's the case. Another time we walked into the booking area, and the chair was rocking back and forth like someone had just recently used it. This next story deals more with a crazy individual, but it's still odd. Me and another officer were in the booking area. An inmate in a cell was asking if she could have some of her stuff back, as another officer took her things because she kept kicking the door and threw her stuff everywhere. She had been complaining the whole week, and we informed her that she could have some of her stuff back. She seemed so thankful when we handed it back over. We go back to what we were doing before, and 15 minutes later, she starts screaming and cussing. We tell her to knock it off, and she screams at us to shut up. I open the window to her cell and she's staring at me and starts accusing me of cursing her Bible. I tell her that I haven't touched it, and she calls me a liar. We open up her cell and she opens up the Bible and tells me that all the words are backwards. The text in the Bible was completely normal, but she had drawn some pretty weird figures in the Bible itself. I take it and tell her that she's had enough of the Bible, since that's what sparked her last episode. I look over in her cell and she had drawn a ginormous demon head in her cell room. I yell at her for damaging property, and she starts mumbling some gibberish. My co-worker and I have had enough by this point, but she sprints out of her cell, so we go after her and catch up to her. Within a yard, I tell her to go back to her cell. She starts saying more gibberish quickly, and it's getting uncomfortable. My co-worker pulls out his taser and threatens if she doesn't listen, that she will be tased. She starts screaming at us to do it. Now usually this is pretty easy, but we're both shocked because she's usually pretty level-headed and listens to my co-worker, so we hesitated and repeated the warning again. She continued to yell and scream random things, so my co-worker lit her up, and we finally got her into her cell and took her things away. Her camera showed her standing in the corner of her cell right where she drew the demon head. We changed the screen to a few different cameras to look at the other cells for a bit, and about 15 minutes later I motioned to my partner to change it back to her camera. Her cell came onto our screen, and she was still standing in the corner. Only she turned her head, stared directly at the camera and yelled, "I love you guys," and laughed uncontrollably. This is the part that disturbed me the most. Inmates can't tell when we changed cameras on our screens. My partner and I immediately look at each other with an oh shit type of look. She timed it so perfectly as soon as we checked out her cell. I've been pissed at inmates before, but never creeped out like she made me. How she was acting, she could have just been having an episode. People coming off drugs usually act strange or violent. I would have just written it off as that, as I try to make sense of it, but I can't explain how she followed up with that little act. The next night, though, she claimed she had no memory of such an event, so who knows what it could have been. My mother works at a maximum security prison. There was an inmate that tried taking his own life. She walked in on him and she pulled him down and performed CPR. She ended up getting his heart to start again, but the damage was already done. The man was brain dead. This traumatized her pretty badly, and she got minor PTSD from it. It was bad enough that she needed therapy. Fast forward about a year or so after this event, stuff started happening around the house. Paper would come flying out of our printer, objects would fall over the shelves, and the TV would turn on and off at random times. These events escalated until one night my mother woke up with her arm in pain. She looks over and her husband is laying on her arm. "Hey, wake up," she says. "You're on my arm." My stepfather nudges her arm some more. "What the hell? Get off my arm." Now mind you, my mother had surgery on her arm in the past, and it's incredibly painful even to this day, so she's in a lot of pain. She tries to push him off until she finally says, "Get off my arm, you're hurting me." At this point, my stepfather opens his eyes, turns over that all of his weight is pinning my mum's arm down, except it wasn't my stepfather. This man had a tomato red face, black eyes, and a toothy smile that stretched to either end of his face to ear. Good. My mum proceeded to flip out and start crying. "Stop, get off my arm." My mother eventually pries her arm out from under the intruder and runs downstairs. She wakes the kids up and takes them into the living room to prepare to call 911. My stepfather comes down to the living room, except he is himself. He's wondering what the hell is going on, and my mother is screaming to get away from the kids and get out the house. It was pretty intense. Eventually, my mum saw that it was actually my stepdad and calmed down. It was about this point she decided that it was probably time they get outside help. So they called my step-grandfather. My step-grandfather's wife has a brother that is a retired priest who currently lives somewhere in Mexico. By calling my step-grandpa, they got his contact info and invited him up to the States as a sort of consultant. He ended up flying up and listening to our story. He said that he's heard of paranormal things happening to people in his line of work, but never to the extent of what was happening to us. He gave us some contact information for a female pastor that travels around and deals with this kind of stuff. He described her to us as someone who was especially sensitive to paranormal phenomena. He told us to just call her, tell her that he referred her to us, and to invite her over. Nothing more. He was specific about not telling her anything about what was happening, and that as soon as she steps foot in the house, she'll immediately start to spout off stuff about your house's history and people who have passed there. So we give her a call. My mother followed the priest's instructions, and as they were saying their goodbyes, the pastor starts yelling, "Stop! Someone is trying to talk to you." She is extremely angry. She wants me to tell you that you moved it, and she wants you to put it back where it was right now. And then she hung up. So it just happened that when my family was having a garage sale at one time, we moved some of the more useless stuff we had in the house to the basement. Now, one of these things were these dolls. These weren't just any dolls. They were vintage dolls from when my great-grandmother was a girl. Before she passed away, she was extremely adamant about my mother inheriting them. She was definitely the type of person to get angry over something like moving her possessions somewhere. As soon as the pastor hung up, she knew exactly what the pastor was talking about and moved the dolls. Now the thing with the pastor didn't quite work out. On the day that she was supposed to visit, she forgot our address and phone number and looked on her phone to contact us, except all of our contact information was erased. We ended up calling her later that day. We gave her our number and address again, and she said that she was still more than willing to come over. At this point, she got into her car and it wouldn't start. She called a towing company to try and get it to the shop so it could be fixed. Except the tow truck got into an accident on the way over to her house. Suffice to say, there were, or coincidentally, maybe not, a lot of strings of bad luck, so she was never able to come. So since that didn't work out, we went to a different source for help. We called a local paranormal investigation company. It was an interesting experience to say the least. They came over and spent the night, split up into groups and investigated different parts of the house. They had cameras and recorders that supposedly pick up on super low frequencies, and one of the things they caught was a demonic-looking face floating somewhere in our great room, as well as several orbs, and a bunch of stuff on the voice recorders. They interviewed, or so they say, 4 different entities. They identified a young girl, an old teenager, and a woman by the name of Lorelei, and a man called Frank. Now this caught my mother's attention, because it just so happened that the man that my mother resuscitated was called Frank. Upon more investigation, the man said that he liked my mother and hated that stepfather of mine. That was about all that happened. For a while, the paranormal investigators became kind of famous within their community, because they gathered a lot of evidence. So around this time is when I took some leave from the Navy and came back home. It was very quiet while I was there, except for one night. I was sitting in the living room reading when I felt someone was watching me. It got so bad, I actually went outside with a flashlight and started looking through bushes because I was convinced that someone was stalking me. It ended up being nothing, but the feeling didn't go away for a few more hours. Fast forward some months, my uncle's childhood best friend that we hadn't spoken to in many years stopped by for a barbecue. He had a new girlfriend. As soon as my family's friend and his girlfriend stepped through the door, the woman stopped abruptly and asked, "How many do you have?" My mother said, 5 children, 4 are from me and the other is a stepdaughter. "No, that's not what I meant." My mum said uncertainly, "We have 4 ghosts. A little girl, a teenager, a woman and a man." "No, you have at least 2 men, because I have 2 brutes that are currently screaming in my face and telling me to get out." My mother and her had a very long conversation. Now, I would take what I'm about to tell you with a grain of salt. As soon as my mother told me this, I said, "No way," and called ball. But maybe I'm wrong. The woman told my mother that she's always had the ability to see ghosts, among other things. She used to shatter light bulbs above her mother's head when she was little. One day her teacher was being mean to her. The next thing you know, she's being lifted in midair and pinned against a wall by some invisible force. So yeah, I'm not too sure about some of the stuff she said. But the whole sensitivity thing was pretty consistent with our experiences. Something else that she'd told us was the whole land around us was very haunted. She said the neighbors across from us have nothing less than an infestation, and that she's never seen anything like it. When she left, all the paranormal events stopped. It's been quiet ever since. She later contacted my mother and mentioned that 2 of the men that were shouting at her left with her because they found out that she could see and hear them. They started messing with her by hiding her stuff under her bed and knocking stuff over. She told us that she could get rid of them though, so not to worry. And since then it's been quiet. No problems except for this one time my mother was all alone in the room when the spring door stopper started rapidly vibrating to side. Not the, "oh, there must be a truck" that just shook the house. This was like someone pulled this thing from its full range and let go and was playing with it. My mother remembered the little ghost girl that was in the house and said, "I know you're there, honey. It's okay if you want to play a little. You can stay here as long as you're not mean." And that was that. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed tonight's video. So as you may have noticed, there was no upload yesterday. I did post something. There was a fire really nearby our house. Melted the internet cabling. But the guys at the internet company worked all through the night. And when I woke up this morning, much to my surprise, because I really did think this was going to be, we were going to be in here for the long haul. No internet for a week or something. Because, my internet company isn't the best. Turns out, because it's not a one-person problem, it's I don't know how many people it affected, but at least it's 300-400 houses that they were on it, and that they worked through the night, and it was fixed by the time I got up. So that was really, really cool. So yeah, I'm really glad that we have connection again. I hope you enjoyed the video. If of course you did, you know what to do. Let me know down below. Also, what do you think of prisons? I had a really interesting conversation a few years ago with a prison officer, and he told me that, prisons are useful for what they do, but he tried to convince me that they weren't that ethical because of the toll that it plays on people and all this other stuff. I'm not going to go into the details, but I'm just interested in hearing what you guys have to say. Do you think prisons are ethical? Do you think they're worth having? I'm not saying kill everyone, by all means, no. But just interested in hearing what you guys thought, because it was a really lively debate, shall we say. As always, a huge thank you to my lovely patrons for your continued support. It really does mean a lot. If you would like your name on the screen and would like to become a patron, you know how to do it. Follow the link in the description to patreon.com and, just go from there. The competition. Please follow me on Instagram and Twitter. When we hit 3,000 on each of them, there'll be a giveaway. Yay! Once the postal service resumes. In any case, just be sure to follow me over there. And when we hit 3,000, I'll record the random poll thing. And yeah, a winner will be announced. All right then, guys. It's time for me to sign off. Stay awesome. And I'll see you in the next one.